So, as you all already know from the title of the episode, today we are going to be discussing the events of the Hungarian Revolution. This episode builds on our last episode where we laid all of the groundwork explaining the situation in Hungary leading up to October of 1956. So, if you haven't already seen that episode, you really should go watch it. Go, now, go. Okay, now where were we? Right. Budapest in October of 1956 was at a leading edge in changing feelings towards socialism. The death of Stalin 3 years before, Khrushchev's secret speech a few months earlier, years of political oppression and economic stagnation, all of this was coming together in a movement demanding real change. I'm your host David, and today we are looking at the 1956 Hungarian uprising. This is the Cold War. Okay, so as I've mentioned, the liberalizing atmosphere that was developing after Stalin's death was certainly giving new hope to Hungarians interested in bringing reforms to their own country. But it wasn't just the changes in the Soviet Union they were looking at. They had also just seen a spate of successful reforms enacted in Poland after the so-called Poznan June, a smallish revolt that had taken place in the city of Poznan. Here's the link to the video that we did on that. Now, not only had Poland installed a new reformist government with more local control, but they had also arranged for the removal of large numbers of Soviet army troops from Poland. As you'll recall, following Stalin's death, Rákosi Mátyás, the Stalinist post-war Hungarian leader, had been removed from leadership, replaced by the reformer Nagy Imre, who had set about releasing political prisoners and reinstating to the Hungarian Workers' Party anti-Rákosi members who had previously been expelled. Public forums were being held with workers, students, and intellectuals all taking part. Vitally, when Rákosi ousted Nagy and regained power, no rollbacks on these liberalizations occurred. Even when Rákosi was permanently ousted and replaced by his heir apparent, Gerard Ernő, no re-Stalinization occurred. As you can imagine, all of this bolstered hope for increased permanent freedoms in the country. That brings us to October 1956. Agitation and public calls for change were becoming more prevalent. On October 23rd, over 20,000 people gathered in Budapest at the statue of József Bem, a Polish revolutionary who had taken part in the 1848 Hungarian Revolution. At that gathering, the president of the Writers' Union of Hungary, Veres Péter, read a manifesto to the crowd, what has become known as the 16 Points. It demanded the withdrawal of all Soviet troops from Hungary, free and open multi-party elections, a new government led by Nagy Imre to lead Hungary to those elections, as well as the complete reorganization of the Hungarian economy. The 16 Points also called for freedom of the press and the restoration of Hungary's national symbols in place of the communist ones that had been adopted since the end of the war. It was this gathering that first witnessed one of the most prominent symbols of the revolution, a Hungarian flag being waved with the communist coat of arms cut from the middle. This crowd on Bem Square then spontaneously moved from Bem Square across the river to the Parliament buildings to continue the demonstration there. At this point, the working day for many was ending, and the crowd swelled to as many as 200,000 people. Despite the large crowd, things remained peaceful, although there were hints that things at this point were beginning to radicalize. The constant outcry from the demonstrators were calls for the Soviets, simply referred to as Russians, to go home. By the evening of the 23rd, the Hungarian leadership had grasped the severity of the situation. Gera made the decision to publicly condemn both the 16 Points and the demonstrations as a whole. He also made a private request to the Soviet ambassador to Hungary for military assistance. The ambassador's name, by the way, Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov. Remember that name for later. Back in the square outside Parliament, where the demonstration was occurring, calls for Nagy to speak increased until at 8:45 p.m. on the evening of the 23rd, he appeared. Now, his speech that night actually called for the dispersal of the demonstration to allow him time to secure the reforms everyone was looking for. This is actually totally on brand for Nagy, who was not a firebrand revolutionary, but rather more of a moderate. Understand that Nagy was still a dedicated communist, one who believed in gradual reforms to transition to increased sovereignty and possibly even democracy for his country. The crowd left Parliament, but did not disperse, instead splitting into two groups. One group moved towards the building housing Hungarian Radio, and the other towards Stalin Square. The second group moved onto Stalin Square at the edge of the Városliget, the city square, and set about destroying the statue of Stalin, a gift that had been presented to the country in 1951 to mark the Vojd's 70th birthday. According to Kopacsi Sándor, the head of the police at the time, the demonstrators placed a thick steel rope around the neck of the 25-meter tall Stalin statue, while the other people, arriving in trucks with oxygen cylinders and metal-cutting blowpipes, were setting to work on the statue's bronze shoes. An hour later, the statue fell down from its pedestal. Only the boots remained, and Hungarian flags were quickly planted in them. Now, the second group that left Parliament that night had moved towards Hungarian Radio. The crowd entered the building and demanded that the 16 points be read over the radio waves. The request was refused and a standoff began. A rumor began to spread outside the building that those inside had been detained by the AVH, the secret police, and tension began to spiral. This is where the demonstrations took a significant turn. The AVH opened fire on the crowd, killing 3. This did not disperse the crowd, but only angered it instead, and violence flared. The AVH, realizing their predicament, called for the Hungarian military to provide support and troops were dispatched. However, the soldiers not only didn't move against the crowd, but actively joined them and began firing on the AVH troops. The AVH troops, at the direction of Kopacsi Sándor, then declared themselves for the demonstrators and joined the burgeoning revolution. They opened their weapons depots and the revolutionaries began to arm themselves. Soviet leadership in Moscow quickly understood the gravity of the situation and, after short discussion, immediately decided that the best course of action would be to dismiss Gera as first secretary of the Hungarian Workers' Party and appoint Nagy as the new prime minister in place of Hegedus András, who had been PM since 1955. This would be done in exchange for Nagy agreeing to accept that Soviet troops would remain in Hungary to ensure stability. This was actually an offer which Nagy accepted. In the early morning hours of October 24th, 6,000 Soviet troops accompanying hundreds of tanks entered Budapest and took control of the city's main streets and squares. Opposing them, armed rebels had 3 main strongholds in Budapest. On the Pest side of the river was the area surrounding the Corvin Theatre, as well as the area around Baros Square, while on the Buda side, they had invested themselves around Sena Square, below the castle district. Of course, we would be remiss if we didn't also point out that Budapest was not the only site of revolt. Hungarians in Debrecen, Miskolc, and Csepel had all taken to the streets in support. The entire country was tense and divided, and not just between the Soviet-backed government supporters and the protesters, but within the factions of the protesters themselves. On one side was Nagy, who called for calmness so that reforms could be enacted. However, many of the protesters did not want to wait for reform. They wanted immediate action to dismantle the entire system then and there. The Soviets continued to move new troops into the city as fighting continued, but were forbidden to use artillery or airstrikes as they engaged with the demonstrators. So clearly fighting is going on, but who was fighting who? Well, as you can guess, the protesters were fighting the Soviet troops who were being brought into the city. The protesters were also fighting AVH troops who largely had remained loyal to the Moscow-backed government, in part out of fear of what would happen to them if the regime they had so brutally served suddenly fell. But where did the Hungarian army stand on all of this? Well, it was largely divided. Some units were protecting or had even joined the protesters, while other units were actively fighting against them, trying to put down the rebellion. The next day, October 25th, saw another large demonstration outside of the Parliament building. At some point during the demonstration, either AVH or Soviet troops, it's unclear which, opened fire, resulting in the deaths of 75 people. The result of this massacre was a massive boost in support for the rebels. I'm going to call them rebels now, including hundreds of the demonstrators moving into the rebel strongholds. It's likely that at this point there were perhaps up to 2,000 armed rebels in Budapest. After the massacre on the 25th, the reaction of men like Gera and Hegedus was not to stay and find a way to quell the rebellion, but rather to flee the country to the Soviet Union. The rebellion was spreading, and by then Debrecen, Miskolc, Csepel, and Pécs were under full control of the rebels. In Budapest, skirmishes continued with the rebels finding success, even repelling an assault by Soviet troops on the Corvin Theatre, destroying 4 tanks in the process. Nagy understood that the situation in his country was precarious, with a real possibility that the conflict would spiral out of control, endangering the uprising itself. On October 27th, he announced the formation of a new government, one which included 4 non-communists. At the same time, he was negotiating with representatives from Moscow, Anastas Mikoyan and Mikhail Suslov, in an attempt to win some of the reforms demanded by the rebels. By the next day, the 28th, a ceasefire had been arranged. The fighting had claimed the lives of over 1,000 rebels and at least 500 Soviet troops. The agreement Nagy came to stipulated that Soviet troops would be withdrawn not only from Budapest, but also from Hungary. In exchange, the Nagy government would restore order to the country and disarm the rebels. Nagy also announced on the 28th his support of the revolution, that the AVH was being dissolved, and that a new National Guard was to be formed, made up of elements of the police, the army, and the rebels. In addition, 8,000 political prisoners were to be released, and political parties which had been banned under the Rákosi regime were allowed to operate. So everything seems good for the Hungarians, right? Well, as I'm sure you can guess, it didn't stay that way. In the days following the ceasefire, the crowds of demonstrators captured and then subsequently lynched several hundred members of the AVH and the Hungarian Workers' Party. The most significant example of this happened on the 30th, when a renewed skirmish between the rebels and the AVH broke out at the headquarters of the Hungarian Workers' Party. The AVH troops surrendered, and 23 of their officers were then summarily executed. This anti-communist violence was, as you can imagine, not at all well received in Moscow, and strengthened the argument of those who wanted to forcibly put down the rebellion. But what was the overall viewpoint from Moscow? Well, from the beginning, it was divided. On one side were those who wanted to immediately resort to force, but there was a more moderate group, notably led by Khrushchev and Zhukov, who feared a disastrous international outcome, similar to that being suffered by the French and the British in the Suez at the same time that the Hungarian revolt was playing out. Khrushchev was hoping for an outcome similar to what had been arranged in Poland, where the Nagy government would remain communist and inside the Soviet sphere of influence. In fact, on the 30th, before the attack and execution of the AVH troops in Budapest, the Soviet government had pledged to tolerate the Nagy government and would reconsider the status of Soviet troops stationed in Warsaw Pact nations. When Soviet leadership heard about the anti-communist attacks and the murder of the AVH troops, this line of moderate thinking was swept from the table. Clearly seeing the depth of anti-communist mood in the country, and coupled with Nagy's recent decision to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact, coupled with a declaration of neutrality, a decision to act was made. On October 31st, the Politburo reversed its earlier decision and resolved to use force to put down the revolution. The date was set for November 4th. As Soviet troops began to mass on the Hungarian border, Nagy was reassured by Ambassador Andropov that there was nothing to fear and it was routine troop movements. Nagy, not anybody's fool, understood what was happening and, in a bid to draw on international support from the West, publicly announced the withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact and declared Hungary neutral. On November 3rd, Ambassador Andropov met with the Hungarian Minister of Defense, Máté Pál, himself a colonel of an armored division, who had defected to the rebels after being initially ordered to destroy them. They met at the Tokol Soviet barracks to discuss the terms of the Soviet withdrawal. Although the meeting seemed to go well, Máté was arrested by the KGB towards the end of the meeting. By this point, Soviet troops had encircled Budapest, and the Hungarian army found themselves totally unprepared for what was to come. Nagy was reluctant to order his own troops to fire on the Soviets, still hoping to find a peaceful solution. Now, there could only be one possible outcome. In the early hours of November 4th, Soviet forces went into action and brutal repression followed. Nagy fled to the Yugoslavian embassy, where he sought refuge. As fighting intensified, Kádár János announced the establishment of a new government, the Hungarian Revolutionary Worker-Peasant Government. Nagy was lured out of the Yugoslav embassy on the promise of safe passage from Hungary, but was promptly arrested. Nagy was executed 2 years later. Lacking any central control, no widespread organized resistance was possible, and the defense of Budapest and other regions of Hungary fell to isolated pockets of rebels, which the Soviet army systematically crushed. By the 9th of November, the fighting was done, and Hungary had been subdued. No outside support would be forthcoming for the rebels, as the West was otherwise distracted by the Suez Crisis and was not willing to risk a war with the Soviet Union. In all, between 2,500 and 3,000 Hungarians died as a result of the fighting, and estimates of those wounded ranged anywhere from 13,000 to 20,000 people. On the Soviet side, over 700 soldiers were killed and as many as 1,500 wounded in the fighting. Significantly though, over 180,000 Hungarians fled the country, most heading west across the border into neighboring Austria. Of those who remained in Hungary, 22,000 people were brought before the courts and imprisoned, and as many as 350 people were executed. Kádár János would remain head of a Soviet-backed communist Hungary until 1988, by which time the winds of change had begun to blow. We hope you've enjoyed this second episode of the Cold War Channel's presentation of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. Please be sure you're subscribed to the channel and have pressed the bell button so that you don't miss any future videos. As always, we are available via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com and are also active on both Facebook and Instagram. Please consider supporting us financially via YouTube membership or via Patreon at www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. Any support you may be able to provide is greatly appreciated. This is the Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.